everyone, this is Political History and Geopolitics of the World. We are still on the topic Territorial Geopolitics, and last time we had our discussion regarding the territory as well as a detailed discussion on the different classifications or types of territory. Now this time we are going to talk about the borders and boundaries. Now to start our discussion, let us first define what really is a border. So what is a border? As indicated in your screen, a border is a geographic boundary of political entities or legal jurisdictions such as governments, sovereign states, federated states, and other subnational entities. In other words, a border may signify the legal demarcation or the official demarcation or yung extent or sakop or scope ng isang estado or ng teritoryo ng isang estado. Okay? So the border signifies the start as well as the end of the extent of the territory of a specific state or a legal entity. Okay, like for example, in our picture here, this depicts the tri-point border of the countries of Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil in South America following yung route ng ilog na iyan or even that falls as indicated in the photo below between Brazil and Argentina. So this is a tri-point border. Now another example would be this. This is one of those friendly borders, okay, signifying the official start and end insofar as the borders between Portugal and Spain in Western Europe or in the Iberian Peninsula in Europe. Okay, another example would be this interesting border between Poland and Ukraine as signified doon sa fish, sort of like fish shape or symbol dyan, okay, indicating the friendly border between these two countries in Eastern Europe. Okay, and another example, okay, so another interesting border here, tri-point borders between among Slovakia, Hungary, and Austria in Europe. And then another, this is one of those interesting and colorful border. This one signifies the border between India and Pakistan as exemplified in this border closing ceremony in the town of Wagah in India or Pakistan. And this ceremony took place at 2 hours before sunset. So every evening kinakandak iyan. Okay, so this signifies the friendly relation supposedly between India and Pakistan kasi Buaga is one of those traditional transit routes or train routes, or this transnational train routes between Pakistan and India. And yung pinaka highlight ng ceremony yan ng border closing ceremony na yan is this silly walk march, okay, conducted or done or performed by the border guards by both Pakistan and India. It's actually an interesting sight to behold, lalong-lalo na when we consider the most of the time unfriendly relations between Pakistan and India following the partition of India in 1947 at saka yung series of skirmishes or violent or armed conflicts or exchange of fires that are continuously happening between these two neighboring nations, India and Pakistan. Okay, so that is what is meant by this so-called border. Now, borders are, of course, established through agreements. So, bilateral, unilateral in nature, or imposed by a third party. Okay? So, borders, as read in your screen, are established through agreements or treaties between political or social entities that control those areas. And most of the time, yung involved dito ay yung, of course, yung mga neighboring na mga states or those countries that do border each other, okay? And to officially demarcate the line that defines the border or the extent of territories of these two states. Hence, nagkakaroon ngayon tayo ng tinatawag nating boundary delimitation, of which yung creation of the agreements that pave the way or create these boundaries or borders is yun nga yung boundary delimitation na tinatawag. Okay, like for example, between Canada and United States, now the border between these two countries in North America is considered to be the longest continuous boundary or border in the world because it's too long, ano, kasi it extends from the Pacific coast all the way to Atlantic Ocean. Okay, it's also one of those geometric boundaries na tinatawag kasi it follows this specific latitude, yung invisible line, ano, that straddles or that, that envelopes or surrounds the Earth. Okay, another example of boundary delimitation is we have this boundary or border between the United States and Mexico, which is one of those borders na contested or medyo strict, ano, yung kanilang patrolling, and then yung existence ng numerous checkpoints that exist between these two countries, ano, United States and Mexico, following the flow of the Rio Grande River, okay, for most of the boundary. Okay, so this is what the boundary delimitation between the United States and Mexico looks like. As you can see there, okay, the boundary or the border is indicated by the existence of this tall wall na may mga numerous na mga infrastructures built within the wall, okay, in order to deter the entrance or the illegal entrance of migrants coming from Mexico, as well as yung mga Central American citizens coming from Guatemala, Nicaragua, okay, and some other countries in South America as well, particularly those coming from Venezuela kasi napaka-pangit ng kondisyon ngayon sa bansa nila. And so, the US is seen as one of those countries or the country that they see as giving them hope, the land of opportunity, as they say. And so, numerous migrants take the step toward entering the United States border illegally, okay, even though most of the time, most of these migrants are being forced or deported immediately. Okay, so very few lamang yung nakakapasok din eventually ng United States kasi sabi ko nga, it's one of those strictest borders in the world. And yung border na yan, it's very imposing. Tapos meron pa silang mga multiple defense lines, ano, like yung snipers sa mga tower guards, border patrol or border guards on horseback, and then they even have dogs, ano, to sniff doon sa mga nakapasok illegally. Pero of course, due to the desert, the hot conditions on the desert, ultimately marami ring mga migrants who have entered the US illegally ang namamatay because of the harsh conditions of the desert. As well as they have to cross pa the Rio Grande River, which is yung border kasi ng United States and Mexico ay nasa gitna ng Rio Grande River, and so they have to cross that. Pero more often than not, there are river border patrol guards then that do patrol the rivers, and so day and night, and so nahuhuli din sila even they have to attempt the crossing. Okay? And then between the United States and Canada, it's relatively docile or calm, okay, in comparison to that border between the United States and Mexico. Okay? So remember, borders are created through agreements, between these two countries that want to formally define the extent of their territories or their respective territories, and then we call that as boundary delimitation. Okay, what is the difference then between a border and a boundary now? So, formally speaking, there's not much difference between these two concepts, pero the difference between these two is that typically, as we had stated kanina, there is no distinction between the terms boundary and border in everyday language. However, many authors use border to designate the formal political division line between territorial units such as states. So it may be interstate or intra-states. And yung boundary naman, it is used to signify the cultural and social group difference that may or may not be marked on the ground by division lines. So in short, kung makikita natin, kung mahihinuha natin sa distinction supposedly ng border and boundary, a border is that visible line, okay, that marks the extent or the scope of territory of two states, okay. So that's the visible line there. Like for example, the presence or the existence of a fence or a wall, that signifies the border. Samantalang kapag ka boundary naman, it's either it refers to either the cultural or social group difference. Like for example, cultural boundaries, even personal boundaries are used, ano, that may or may not be marked on the ground by division lines. So in short, boundaries are this invisible lines that do signify differences insofar as cultural and social concerns or group differences are concerned. So that's the difference between the two concepts. Now, some borders, such as a state's internal administrative border or interstate borders, are often open and completely unguarded. Okay, so of course, nangyayari yan sa mga friendly na mga nations, okay? Especially kapag magka-jive yung ideology, or they are very friendly toward each other. Okay, so more often than not, borders are often open and completely unguarded. Pero that was before. Okay, so even for example, the border between Canada and the United States, walang masyadong fence dyan. Pero of course, very strict pa rin kasi they have to check your passports, visa for example, in order for one to enter Canada or the United States or vice versa legally. So kailangan pa rin ng mga legal na mga instruments na iyon in order for you to enter one state or another. Okay, pero some borders, like for example, in the case of a country or a state's internal administrative border, like for example, here, in the case of the Philippines, so ito yung tinatawag nating, like what? Internal administrative border ng ating bansa, okay? Signifying the borders in between provinces. Okay, for example, between Ifugao and Isabela, okay, so you have the border there, as well as the different provinces and even islands sa ating bansa. So ito yung example ng tinatawag nating internal administrative border. Okay, another example would be the Schengen Area. The Schengen Area is an area comprising about 26 European states. More specifically, yung mga member states ng European Union. So, itong Schengen Area, okay, comprising of those 26 European states that have officially abolished all passport and all other types of border control. So, usually, you have to hand in your passport or visa in order for you to legally enter a specific country. But there are states in the European Union, particularly yung mga bansa na nag-implement ng Schengen policy na ina-abolish na yung passport. So kumbaga meron silang common passport or common visa for use ng mga citizens who want to enter one specific state or another. So the Schengen area mostly functions as a single jurisdiction for international travel purposes with a common visa policy. So aside from the fact that they have this common currency in the European Union, they also have the common visa policy na kapag ka holder ka ng Schengen visa or Schengen like card, you can enter one state, okay, Spain or France, okay, without needing visas, so to speak. So you have that single visa to be used kapag ka mag-e-enter ka from or mag-hop ka from one state to another. So yun yung kagandahan ng common visa policy as exemplified by the Schengen area, which is an interstate border. Now, of course, there are friendly borders and there are, of course, borders that are strict insofar as border controls are concerned. So other borders are partially or fully controlled. More often than not, majority ng mga bansa sa mundo, they fully control their borders. Okay, with the with indicated by the presence of walls, okay, or checkpoints na very strict. They have to check everything, okay, especially kapag vehicular traffic, from, say for example, between Mexico and the United States, meron kang checkpoint na dadaanan na you would have to hand in your passport and so on in order for you to legally enter the United States. So, from one state to another, it can only be crossed legally only at designated border checkpoints and border zones, which may be controlled. Okay, like for example, as I stated kanina, this of course is the boundary or the border between the United States and Mexico. So yung indicated dyan na maraming buildings, okay, maraming mga kotse, and perhaps maraming mga tao, that is the Mexican side. And then ito naman na industrialized, na sparsely populated, so to speak, that is the United States side. Okay, it's very hard to enter that one kasi meron silang multiple border controls dyan maliban sa existence ng traditional na border control such as this wall, which has been like revamped, or reconstructed during the term of Donald Trump, na who is famous for his wall, yon. Okay, borders may also foster the setting up of these so-called buffer zones. So what do we mean when we say a buffer zone? A buffer zone is generally a zonal area that lies between two or more areas. Often, countries ang involved dito, but not necessarily. But depending on the type of buffer zone, it may serve to separate regions or even conjoin them. Like for example, in the case of North Korea and South Korea, in between them, you have this demarcation line, okay, the 38th parallel, okay, following the 38th parallel latitude, so to speak. They have this buffer zone na tinatawag din officially as the demilitarized zone or the DMZ. Okay? Kasi it's one of those strictest borders din in the world, aside from the United States and Mexico. So North Korea and South Korea also employs yung multiple series or yung series of border control measures, such as yung presence ng mga tunnels, presence ng mga walls na oftentimes ay fortified with other preventive measures in order to deter a South Korean, for example, or a North Korean from entering South Korea illegally. So, ayun nga. So, they have this military demarcation line, and this DMZ now signifies yung tinatawag na nating buffer zone. Okay, so the only way for one to legally cross South Korea toward North Korea is yung blue house nila na tinatawag. More specifically, the town that, that straddles the border between North Korea and South Korea. Like for example, as exemplified here with the blue house in the background. Okay, so you have the president of North Korea, or the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, and you have the former president of the South. So I'm not really sure of the name, pero they had attempted to actually sort of like conduct peace talks or dialogues between, or negotiations between these two countries, pero to no avail kasi, North Korea is North Korea, right? And the South is an ally of the Western powers, more particularly the United States. And even the United States, in the person of Donald Trump, even attempted to hold talks or negotiations or deals with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, pero I think that also failed. Okay? Pero Donald Trump and yung South Korean presidents have across the North Korean border multiple times. Kapag pinasok mo kasi yung blue house na yan, you can legally sort of like enter the North Korea, pero of course there are buffed up or military dudes there, okay, from the south and even from the north, na who could physically prevent you from entering even the North Korean side or the South Korean side. Okay, so that's how strict that border is between the North and South Korea. Now, a border then, okay, may be agreed by the countries on both sides, like for example in the case of Canada and the United States, or Mexico and the United States. So, yun yung tinatawag nating bilateral agreements, bilateral boundary delimitation, or a border may be imposed by the country on one side. Okay? So, without even consulting yung the other side, yung the other party na tinatawag. So, this is what we term as unilateral boundary delimitation. And then it may be imposed also by third parties, like for example, international conference, like in the case between Pakistan and India. Okay, doon sa Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir region na hotly contested between these two countries. And in order to prevent future conflicts or present conflicts to arise, they had created, or they had agreed upon through the Simla Agreement, to create the line of control, but we can discuss that later. But that's an example of a border that is imposed by third parties, like for example an international conference. Now, a border may also be inherited from a former state, colonial power, or aristocratic territory. Like for example, in the case again of India, okay, na yung kanilang border between them and Pakistan ay imposed by the United Kingdom, being their former colonial ruler. Okay? Or inherited from a former internal borders, like for example dun sa mga bansa na existing ngayon that were formerly part of the Soviet Union or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So they had inherited their borders from their former internal border when they were still part of the Soviet Union. So yun yung iba't iba na po pwedeng paraan or process by which boundary delimitation or border settings may be created. Okay? Or a border may be, of course, never formally defined, pero through, this intergenerational na pagtanggap or acceptance, of course, even though never formally defined, they still follow the border, so to speak. Okay, so political borders. So, political borders are imposed on the world through human agency. So, pagka sinabi natin human agency, it's through the initiative of humans through either boundary setting or boundary delimitation, as has been discussed earlier. So, that means that although a political border may follow a river or a mountain range, kasi, it can automatically set the official demarcation line between states, pero such features like yung rivers or mountains does not automatically define the political border. So kailangan pa rin ng intervention ng humans in order to formally define the border. Okay? So kailangan pag-usapan yan bilaterally, or it can be imposed by third party. So that's how political borders work, through the intervention or initiative of humans who created such borders through bilateral talks or unilateral agreement, so to speak. So, political borders are often classified by whether or not they follow conspicuous physical features on the earth. Okay, like for example, in the case of the United States and Mexico, majority ng border nila ay located or followed or created doon sa flow ng Rio Grande River. So yung border nila in the middle of the Rio Grande River. So yun yung example ng political borders that were created following yung conspicuous physical features on the earth. Conspicuous, ito yung visible. Ito yung very obvious na susundan mo or gagawin mong inspiration when you create the so-called border, or even mountains may serve as the basis or the baseline by which political borders are created. Like for example, in the case of Switzerland and Italy and Austria, so they had formed their borders out of the existence of using or utilizing this conspicuous physical features such as the Alps as their basis for their boundary delimitation. Now, of course, since ang political borders ay created through human agency or human intervention, sometimes political borders or boundaries may be manipulated. It may be for good, or more often than not, it may be for some obvious political reason or hidden political agenda. Like, for example, I'm not saying na this is entirely a political border manipulation, pero we have to cite this example na lang as possibly an example of a border that is being manipulated to suit a certain political agenda or purpose. Okay, so hindi na tayo lalayo. Okay, we shall be using the case of my dearest province of Isabela as an example of a state or an entity na yung borders niya or boundaries ay minanipulate in order to supposedly or allegedly suit a certain political agenda. Okay, so Isabela is the second largest province in the Philippines. Okay, and even the largest province in mainland Luzon, with Palawan, of course. Hindi naman siya kasali sa mainland, pero Palawan being the largest and Isabela being the second largest. Now, Isabela traditionally was composed of formerly 4 legislative districts. In comparison sa Ifugao na isa lamang yung legislative district. Pero sa Isabela, there were 4 before. And my hometown was included sa 3rd district, sa District 3. Okay, so we have the first district signified by the green areas there. The second district, yung blue areas. Yung third district by the violet. Tapos yung yellow, yung fourth district na. Okay, so if you remember, di ba, kailangan para ma-create yung legislative district, kailangan ng at least minimum na 150,000 na population para ma-create yung certain legislative district. And it so happened that yung populasyon ng Isabela ay nag-hit more than 1.1 million Isabelinos or, Isabeleños, so to speak. And so what the politicians did, okay, way back in 2018, okay, so they had passed a law, and I think that was signed by President Duterte himself, separating or, creating 2 additional legislative districts in Isabela. So, okay sana yan, katanggap-tanggap sana yan, pero the way the borders or the new legislatives are created or carved out from their former legislative districts na kinabibilangan nila, parang napaka-unusual, and it is reminiscent of the practice in the United States called gerrymandering. So we will be defining that later. Now, from the 4 legislative districts, you now have 6 legislative districts. Okay? So you now have 6, 1, okay? The first legislative district, the second legislative district, third, fourth, fifth, and 6. Okay, from 4 to 6. So that new law increased the number of congressional districts in Isabela to 6, which residences simply increased shares in the pie that would divided among political clans. I'm not really sure if the politicians did that in order to suit better yung aims or yung objectives ng political clan na involved dyan. Pero kung titignan natin, say for example, yung District 6, okay, composed by Cauayan City and some other municipalities na hindi naman totally adjacent sa Cauayan City there. So yung 6 dyan, parang totally magkalayo, and yung Cauayan City is totally separated from yung the rest of the municipalities na kabilang sa District 6. Like for example, 6 is hinati ng District 3. Okay, so somehow that is unthinkable, so to speak. So parang, sige, i-include natin ang Cauayan City and yung some other areas, i-group natin sila together. Total, more than 150,000 naman yung populasyon. So that would make it, a legislative district. Okay? So we just don't know kasi for a lack of better word, maybe they were thinking na kapag ginawa nila iyan or gerrymander nila iyan, so to speak, pwedeng ma-distribute yung political clan o yung certain political clan, pwedeng mapunta, okay, pwedeng mapunta sa isang distrito na traditional ay hindi naman nila bastion. Okay, like for example, District 6 and District 5. So I don't want to say anything more regarding that. So that's a highly controversial move by a certain political clan in my home province of Isabela. And yung practice na to, okay, kung ito man, that is, we simply call that practice as manipulating the borders as gerrymandering. So kapag sinabi nating gerrymandering, okay, political border manipulation, okay, like for example, as exemplified here, dito from a map in the United States. I'm not entirely sure kung anong state yan sa United States, pero we had called that as gerrymandering because it looks like this monstrosity na parang salamander. Okay, kasi galing, ang gerrymandering ay galing or derived from the surname of a specific politician in the United States as well as yung salamander. So, Gary plus Mander. Okay? Kasi it's like manipulating the borders of a certain legislative district there in order to, group a certain voter population para makapagbigay ng more votes to a certain politician, so to speak. Alright. To formally define gerrymandering, we call that as the practice intended to establish an unfair political advantage for a particular party or group by manipulating district boundaries. Okay, which is most commonly used in first past the post electoral system, such as that being followed by the Philippines or even in the United States. Alright, so can we call the political border manipulation as Isabela, yung, yung pinaghiwa-hiwalay yung mga 4 original na legislative districts at ginawang 6, do we call that as gerrymandering? Okay, so it's up to you to answer that one. Okay, so another thing about borders is we also have this natural borders. So aside from political borders that were created through human agency or human intervention, ang natural border naman, okay, more often than not, ay created out of the existing natural features or conspicuous physical features on the earth. So a natural border are geographical features that present natural obstacles to communication and transport. So existing political borders are often a formalization of such historical natural obstacles. So yung in-exemplify natin kanina, like for example, between the United States and Mexico, so somehow they have a natural border following yung Rio Grande River na tinatawag. So that's natural river based on existing historical natural obstacles such as rivers or mountain ranges or mountains. So yun yung mga halimbawa ng natural borders. So gaya ng nabanggit natin kanina, rivers may serve as natural borders. Pero it's complicated minsan, kasi these borders have been formalized along natural borders formed by rivers. Like for example, the Niagara River between Canada and the United States, okay, they have this famous Niagara Falls sa United States side, and they have the Horseshoe Falls in the Canadian side, okay, following the flow of the Niagara River. And then yung nabanggit natin kanina, you have the Rio Grande River between Mexico and the United States. And another example, of course, would be the Rhine River between France and Germany. And in Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia, we also have the Mekong River between Thailand and Laos. Okay? So, we have to cite yung example ng Mekong River kasi it's one of those international rivers. International rivers kasi it flows through multiple states or multiple countries. So it flows from its source sa China and then flows all the way to South China Sea, crossing yung mga multiple countries such as Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and ending up sa Vietnam. And then ultimately it empties into the South China Sea. So it's one of those very important geopolitical rivers as well as something na economically important na rivers in the world kasi because of the numerous countries that are dependent on the waters that do come from this river. But sometimes in the recent months, the Mekong River has been a geopolitical hotspot simply because of the manipulations or the intervention, again, coming from China, wherein they had built multiple dams dun sa downstream area ng Mekong River. So since ang source ng Mekong River ay matatagpuan sa China, sa Tibet part, sa Tibetan Plateau part ng China, China by all means has the right to dam the river, pero of course that would impact din yung mga downstream areas, particularly yung mga bansa ng Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, who are dependent on the waters coming from the river. So if you are going to dam, and they did already, the downstream area of the river, that would prevent it from flowing through these countries and emptying into the South China Sea. So parang since economically dependent itong mga bansa na ito, Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and others sa ilog na to, of course they will be heavily impacted by that. So China knows that, and the Southeast Asian countries, these mainland Southeast Asian countries, are fearful of what China can do. Specifically kapag trigger ang China, like what had happened between China and Vietnam. Okay, so indeed, it's one of those geopolitical hotspots in the world. Okay, but anyway, if we are to allow rivers or use rivers as basis for the creation of borders or political borders, okay, if a precise line is desired, it is often drawn along the talweg, the deepest line along the river. So when we do create a formal boundary delimitation between countries na may ilog in between them, okay, usually ang sinusunod dito ay yung pinakagitna ng ilog, or more often than not, ang sinusunod na basis dito ay yung pinaka malalim na parte ng ilog. We call that one as the talweg or the talweg. Like for example, kapag may ilog na flows along a bend or a curve, usually yung talweg, yun yung pinakamalalim na part, tapos kung from the deep part to the shallow part na tinatawag. So yung deep part, that is what we call as the talweg, as exemplified by this video here sa screen natin. Okay, so to explain it further, you have this video. Okay, so yung malalim na part dyan, the deepest line dyan, okay, so yan yung talweg. Okay, so parang may helical flow dyan. Okay, kaya nga deeper part dyan, and then ultimately it empties into this shallow area, creating So more often than not, kapag gustong mag-create ng boundary delimitation, it's usually in the middle, or usually ang basis ay yung malalim na bahagi ng ilog nga, such as yung example dito is yung creek in India na sinunod yung talweg doctrine or talweg principle na tinatawag. Okay, so yun yung talweg. So it usually nasa bend ito, or yung part ng ilog na nagmi-meander or nagka-curve. Okay? So the talweg principle, so basahin nilang natin ito, is the legal principle that if the boundary between two political entities is stated to be a waterway, like for example in the case of a river here, look no further. Okay, the boundary then follows the talweg of that water course. So it starts from the deepest line, okay, or it should be the basis for the determination of the border. So in particular, the boundary follows the center, gitna of the principal navigable channel of the waterway, which is of course yung talweg or yung the deepest part nga. If there are multiple navigable channels in a river, the one principally used for downstream travel, okay, is used. So it can either be the deepest line or the deepest part of the river called the talweg, or usually yung may pinaka-strongest current. Kasi kapag malalim yung part na yon, of course, strong yung current niya. So yun yung usually ginagamit for the determination of boundary creation or delimitation. Alright? Okay, another example of border boundaries, we have this geometric boundary. So yung nabanggit natin kanina. between Canada and the United States. So geometric boundaries are formed by straight lines using yung lines of latitude or longitude. So in the case of the United States, they had followed this certain latitude, okay? Or occasional arcs such as in the case of Pennsylvania or Delaware. So regardless of the physical or cultural features of the area, so ang ginawang basis dito is yung straight lines na based or dependent doon sa nearness niya or proximity to that certain latitude or longitude, which are invisible lines on the earth. So regardless of the physical or cultural features of the area. Much of the border, in fact, between the United States and Canada ay geometric boundary in nature. Pero of course, nagiging natural na yung border niya, more specifically kapag ka nadaan na sa Great Lakes ng North America kasi they have to follow the course or hatiin yung mga Great Lakes para ma-determine yung boundary delimitation between Canada and the United States. So such political boundaries are often found around the states that develop out of colonial holdings. So para mas madali daw, yung determination ng boundary ay isundin na lang yung kung ano man yung boundary that has been delimited noong under colonial rule pa itong mga bansa na to. Like for example, in the case of the United States and Canada, which were formerly part of the UK, United Kingdom, or Great Britain colonial rule. And then of course, you also have countries in Africa na may pinakamaraming bansa sa mundo. And then of course, yung Middle East na dating under majority of the countries in the Middle East were formerly part of the Great Britain Empire or British Empire. Okay, so example, as I stated, is you have the US-Canada border. So yung green na part dyan, that is an example of a geometric border. Okay, it follows this certain latitude. Okay, that invisible line sa Earth natin. Tapos yung blue na dyan na line, okay, that follows naman yung Great Lakes. Okay, kasi that's of course a natural obstacle, okay, and so they have to really create the river following or respecting kung ano man yung na-create na or kung ano man yung limitasyon na na-create ng natural obstacles na ito na Great Lakes. Tapos of course after nyan, the St. Lawrence Seaway, tapos St. Lawrence River, okay, so na-follow na naman yung geometric boundary sa eastern na bahagi na ng United States. Okay, so we also have this relic border. So, ang relic border, it's a former boundary. Okay, so it's a former boundary. It's long gone. Kaya nga ang natitira na lamang is yung kung ano man yung ruined structures left. So, kaya siya tinawag na relic border, which may no longer be a legal boundary at all. However, the former presence of the boundary can still be seen in the landscape, such as the one exemplified sa screen natin. That is of course the infamous Berlin Wall that was constructed by the Soviet Union during the term of Nikita Khrushchev in order to divide or in order to corral East Berlin to West Berlin. Okay? So, yun yung Berlin Wall. So, it's still surviving as of this moment, pero majority ng Berlin Wall has already been torn down or fallen down noong 1989, following the fall of the so-called Berlin Wall. Okay? So, that's the relic border. Alright, so this one is something that exciting. Okay, so you have also these lines of control. So a line of control refers to a militarized buffer border between two or more nations that is yet to be resolved or implemented for permanent border status. So we have to take into account here yung nature ng lines of control as not de jure, but rather lines of control are de facto boundary delimitation. De facto kasi it's on paper lamang, recognized by two countries. Okay? So may border sila, pero yung border na yan, it's yet to be resolved or implemented for permanent border status. So kumbaga, informal pa lamang yung status. Kaya nga siya de facto border. So LOC borders are under military control and are not recognized as an official international border. So example ng lines of control ay the one that exists between India and Pakistan, particularly in that region called Jammu and Kashmir. Okay? So the military control line between the Indian and Pakistani-controlled parts of the formerly princely states of Jammu and Kashmir. So you have the line of control. So it's one of those dangerous, okay, a certain US president has, Bill Clinton has described the border, that line of control between India and Pakistan in the Kashmir region as one of those, or the most dangerous border in the world. Kasi aside from the fact that it's located in a high altitude, it's also under fierce resistance, okay, fierce implementation, or even aggressive implementation between India and Pakistan. Kasi sa LOC kasi, 'di ba, nahati ang Kashmir sa dalawa. The one that is being controlled by Pakistan is yung areas within Kashmir na tinatawag nating Azad Kashmir at saka Gilgit-Baltistan. And yung controlled naman ng India sa southern part, ito naman yung tinatawag natin na Ladakh. Okay, so this Ladakh is controlled by India, and then you have the Pakistan-controlled Kashmir, which is composed by Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. Okay, so this line of control is not recognized legally as an international boundary, but rather serves as, yun nga, sinabi ko sa inyo kanina, as a de facto border. Pero bakit ba tayo nagkaroon ng line of control? So we have to go back then in the year 1947, following the partition of India. So remember, when the British left India hastily, they also hastily drawn a line that would separate India from the Muslim majority Pakistan. So religion became the basis for the determination of boundaries between these two. So ang Kashmir used to be part of the princely states of Jammu and Kashmir. And so pinag-aawayan nila ang Kashmir simply because Pakistan claims na ang majority ng populasyon in Kashmir ay Muslim. And then of course India, yung basis naman nila is the fact that the rulers or the Rajas of Jammu and Kashmir had approached the Indian government para doon na lang sila kabilang or kasali sa India and not Pakistan. So yun yung two opposing perspectives as to Kashmir, as to the case of Kashmir, tinatawag. Okay, so anyway, so they had created, noong 1947, na-create nga itong ceasefire line, okay, with the purpose na matigil muna sana yung exchange of fires between the Indian military and then the Pakistan military as well. So, noong 1967, I think, or from 1972, okay, that ceasefire line has been formally transformed into this so-called line of control nga after the signing of the so-called Simla or Shimla Agreement. So up to this moment, yung line of control na yan has been treated by India as an international boundary, pero Pakistan treats the line of control as merely a working border. So confusing yung status, or very complicated yung status ng LOC. Kasi up to this moment, it's never been resolved yet. It's never been formally defined. It's never been formally recognized, so to speak, or legally recognized. So that's the case of the line of control between India and Pakistan. Okay, another example of a border is you have the line of actual control or LAC. So, ang line of actual control, that is the demarcation line, that separates the Indian-controlled territory from the Chinese-controlled territory doon sa dating princely state of Jammu and Kashmir that was formed after the 1962 war. So, aside from yung areas that are controlled by both Pakistan and India, you also have China, okay, na nag-e-epal na naman, claiming part of Kashmir as being part of their own particularly being part of the Xinjiang Autonomous Region and Tibet Autonomous Region ng bansa nila. So yung certain area, like for example sa Aksai Chin, okay, so ito yung kiniklaim actually ng China as being part of their territory. Okay, so aside from that, there are also other sectors na kiniklaim din ng China as being part of their territory. So yung western sector, yung nabanggit natin kanina, that is of course yung Aksai Chin, okay, sa Ladakh, I think. And then you have sa middle sector naman, yung middle part na nasa Tibet na. So you have the Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh. So ito yung kiniklaim ng China din. And doon sa eastern sector ng claim ng China, you have the Arunachal Pradesh. Okay? Na Arunachal Pradesh and then the Tibetan area. Okay? So sa middle, yung sinabi ko, yung Himachal Pradesh, so to speak. So all of this do signify those areas that are being claimed by China. Pero yung line of actual control, applicable lamang ito doon sa Aksai Chin, particularly that of bordering India and Pakistan and China. So that's the line of actual control. So that's also very highly contested, okay? Kasi since very fierce or aggressive din yung resistance between these two countries na involved dito, kaya nga up to this moment very unfriendly pa rin yung relations ng India and China, simply because of the claims of both India and Pakistan over the Aksai Chin. So they have to create this line of actual control in order to settle the dispute. Pero in recent years, currently, medyo madugo pa rin or very fierce or aggressive pa rin yung fighting na nangyayari, particularly dun sa mga areas na kiniklaim ng India and Pakistan. China, I should say. Okay, so ito nga. So yung three sectors indicated dyan, so that is the Aksai Chin, and then you have the middle sector there, that's Arunachal Pradesh, and then you have the Makmahon line or the so-called Himachal Pradesh there. Okay? Okay, so last na tayo. So we also have these exclaves and enclaves. So we have to discuss din as well. So what is meant by an enclave? So an enclave is a territory or part of one that is entirely surrounded by the territory of one other state. So enclaves may also exist within territorial waters. Enclave is sometimes used improperly to denote a territory that is only partly surrounded by another state. Now, one thing that we should remember about enclaves is that it is a territory or a state that is entirely surrounded by the territory of one other state. So, isa lamang ang nakapalibot sa territory na yan. So, it's like a country that is surrounded entirely by another country. So, yun yung tinatawag nating enclave. So, remember that. So, as exemplified here, okay, so you have the countries or the states of Lesotho and Swaziland. These are countries that are completely surrounded or enveloped by South Africa. So both Lesotho and Swaziland are examples of these enclaves. And enclaves, as we had read kanina, these are states or territories that are entirely surrounded by the territory of another state. So yun yung enclaves. Okay, another example, so you have the Vatican City, which is another example of a state that is surrounded by a city, which is Rome in Italy. So Vatican City within Rome. So napakaliit ng size ng Vatican City. In fact, they say that it can fit Rizal Park in Manila. Okay, so to contrastly, in contrast naman, we also have this exclave. So how is it different from enclave naman? So ang exclave class, it is a portion of a state or territory geographically separated from the main part by a surrounding alien territory. So more often than not, exclaves are parts of a country or a state that is geographically separated by an alien territory. So kapag sinabi nating alien territory, okay, these are foreign territory or territories that do belong to another state. So if for example, you have a state here, tapos meron kang portion of territory here that do belongs to state A. So state A. But then what separates them is yung state B. Okay, so exclave ito kasi separated from its mother state na tinatawag geographically lamang yung separation niya. So unlike an enclave that is entirely surrounded by one state, ang exclave, it can be surrounded by several states naman. Okay, so para hindi tayo malito, ito yung example ng exclave, ano? Okay, so this is the case of Azerbaijan. So yung red dyan, that indicates an exclave. Pero that red part belongs to that lighter yellow country. Okay, I think that's Azerbaijan. Pero separated yung region na yan from its mother state by an alien territory. Okay, so in that case, so you have this country there that straddles or can be located in between or sandwiching that mother state to its geographically separated region. Pero they do still belong to the same country, yun nga lang separated siya from the rest of the mainland state of which merong jurisdiction or sovereignty over that separated region. Okay, another example would be this. I think you're familiar with this. If not, so you have this city in the National Capital Region. This is Caloocan. So you have Caloocan A and then Caloocan B. So yung Caloocan na yan, actually, they are both separated. So yung Caloocan B is separated from Caloocan A kasi you have the alien territories or foreign territories, Valenzuela or Quezon City, that separates Caloocan A to Caloocan B. Okay? But that yung Caloocan A, that is an example of an exclave. So we also have this semi-exclaves naman. Okay, so in contrast to both enclaves and exclaves, ang semi-exclaves ay ganito. So these are areas that, except for possessing an unsurrounded sea border, a coastline contiguous with international waters, would otherwise be enclaves or exclaves. So what makes semi-exclaves different from an exclave is the fact na ang exclave surrounded entirely by land, so to speak. Kapag semi-exclave naman, it is surrounded by or it is bordered by a sea border. Okay, an unsurrounded sea border. So merong dagat, so to speak, na that borders one side of that exclave. And so tinatawag siyang semi-exclave if not for that unsurrounded sea border. Okay, like for example here, okay, so you have yung red mark dyan, okay, that is actually Kaliningrad Oblast, okay, one of those regions na part ng Russia. So, yung na yan, yung semi-exclave of that specific oblast ng Russia ay geographically separated from the Russian Federation. It would have been an exclave kung hindi nga lang sa unsurrounded sea border that borders Kaliningrad Oblast on its one side, on its northern border. So that's why it's termed as a semi-exclave because of that sea border that borders it. Okay, so another example here is we have Alaska. Alaska is another one of those semi-exclaves din. So notice yung unsurrounded sea border, okay, na nakapalibot sa Alaska. Pero Alaska is a state of the United States. Okay, but you have the alien territory of Canada that geographically separates it from the United States. Alaska would have been an exclave kung walang dagat, but because of the dagat, it is a semi-exclave. So remember that always. Ano, yung distinction between a semi-exclave and an exclave. Okay. Yeah, I've had drunk water. Thank you for the reminder. Now, another thing is we also have these semi-enclaves naman. So how is it different naman from an exclave, an enclave, or a semi-exclave? Ang semi-enclaves are areas that, except for possessing an unsurrounded sea border, would otherwise be an enclaves or exclaves. So, semi-enclaves can exist as independent states that border only one other state. Now, ang semi-exclaves, they may be non-independent or they may be non-sovereign. Non-sovereign. So, yun yung semi-exclaves. Ang semi-enclaves, okay, they are independent states most of the time that or border only one other state, and at the same time, they also have the sea, okay, that borders it on one side. Okay? Ang semi-exclaves, do you have the sea, pero it can be bordered by multiple states, and it's a non-sovereign area or a non-independent state most of the time. Ang semi-enclaves, it can exist as an independent state that border only one other state, just like an enclave that is surrounded entirely by other state. Pero, ang semi-enclave ay merong sea border that borders it on one side. So, that is a semi-enclaves. Like for example, in the case of Monaco, that is entirely surrounded by Monaco by France sa isang side niya, and then you have the sea that borders it on its other sides. Then, so hence Monaco is an example of a semi-enclave because Monaco is an independent country. Okay, another example would be the Gambia, which is a country in Africa. So the Gambia is bordered entirely by Senegal, okay, or surrounded entirely by the country of Senegal, pero it would have been an enclave if not for that unsurrounded sea border sa may western portion niya or sa western part niya. So, yun yung semi-enclave na tinatawag natin. Okay, another example would be the country of Brunei. Okay? So remember, ang Brunei ay dalawang portions yan. So you have the mainland, not mainland Brunei, pero the main Brunei na kung saan dito matatagpuan yung capital niya na Bandar Seri Begawan. But it also has this other portion that is entirely surrounded naman by Malaysia. It would have been an enclave if not for the fact that it has a sea bordering it on its other side. Okay? So, that is an example of a semi-enclave. Okay, so another, last one, you have the Semi-exclaves naman. So, ang Semi-enclave ay part of a territory of one country that can be conveniently approached, okay, more specifically by car, wheel traffic, only through the territory of one other country. So, like for example, in the case of Point Roberts or Point Roberts sa may US, Canada. It's a very interesting area because ang Point Roberts in Washington State in the United States ay part ng United States, but then ang Point Roberts ay within Canada. So it can be reached only via car, via this bridge. So kapag dadaan ka ng Canada. So Point Roberts is part of the United States that can only be reached if you pass through the territory of Canada. Okay, so that's a Semi-enclave, so to speak. Okay, so let's play and confuse ourselves. This will be your last learning activity for our class. So I will be sending in the questions relating to this chart. Okay, so please answer them following discussion natin about enclave and exclaves, semi-exclaves, semi-enclaves, and Semi-exclaves. So that ends our discussion on territorial geopolitics, particularly on borders and boundaries. Thank you so much for listening. God bless and thank you.